Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amy Wolf, and I'm the programming coordinator for the Osterville Village Library. Thank you so much for joining us today. And to our friends joining us on Zoom, thank you for being here as well. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Michael Pregot with this informative author talk as he discusses his latest book, Slavery and Abolitionism on Cape Cod, a Massachusetts Incongruity, exploring Cape Cod's ties to the slave trade, abolitionist efforts, and the lives of notable Black individuals in Massachusetts. Dr. Pregot has spent over a half century in the field of education. He has served as a modern language teacher, a high school principal, a district-wide school superintendent, a professor of education, and a university director of an educational leadership department. A longtime Cape resident, he is now researching various aspects of local history, especially in the maritime history of Cape Cod. So without further ado, Dr. Michael Pregot.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming, all of you. I appreciate it. Just to expound a little bit more as what Amy told you, I am not a history man by trade. I majored in foreign language. I got a doctorate from Middlebury languages. I did a whole bunch of languages in my life, but I love the field. When I retired, which was about 6 years ago, roughly, I said, what can I do? So I play golf at the Captain's Golf Course in Brewster. And no one ever heard of that. It's a pretty well-known golf course. Every hole is named after a captain. So 7 years ago, I talked to the pro. I said, where's the book? I said, what are you talking about? What book? He said, who are these men? What do they do? What do they ship? What do they accomplish? So I don't know. So that was my first endeavor. And that got me hooked. Once I went into that, the more research I did about sea captains, it just blew me away. What men did from Cape Cod was amazing, both good and bad, but what they did was simply amazing. It's all around us. It's probably everywhere. Not just Cape Cod, but I think Cape Cod is very rich in history. And just look at the names of the streets as you drive through. Some of these names, if you just look them up, it's amazing what you'll find out what these people did. So anyway, we're gonna talk a little bit about it. This particular book was written in 1818. It's called Torture. It's called Torture in America. The name of the book. It was written by a fellow who said, "We can't have slavery. It's absolutely immoral. Should not do it." It was one of the many books that was written as an anti-slavery endeavor. Let's begin talking about a few people who came from Falmouth. Falmouth is fairly close to here. I tried to get as close to here as I could. In terms of, can you hear me okay? Yeah. In terms of, connection. I want to make a connection between here and there. And Wiano is absolutely connected. Many things happen in Wiano. We'll talk about that as I get there. But one of the founders of Falmouth was a guy named Hatch. And what he did, he had several indigenous slaves. Indigenous slaves were very common back then. It was not unusual for people to have 1, 2, 3 indigenous slaves. How do they acquire them? A couple of ways. Any war that we had Pequod War, we had a number of wars. If they claimed that you were lost in a war, you could claim them. In fact, that we paid the soldiers with slaves. Some of the Americans were colonies. It wasn't a state back then. If you fought for the American colonies, sometimes you were given a slave as recompense. You weren't given money, but you can be given a young man, young woman, whatever, a domestic. That's how they paid you back in the day. This particular guy knew the languages well. One of the things in his favor, he was very friendly with the Wampanoags. He learned their language well. He acquired the language ability. He wanted the indigenous people to thrive with his intentions, but he still enslaved them. So you could say it's good or bad, depending on how you view it in today's moral stand. The other thing he did too, was mentioned in the book, he negotiated the land deals. When the Mashpee was kind of set up, when the Wampanoags were put in Mashpee as a group, he said, well, let's see what we can do for the other territories. And he negotiated Falmouth and all other towns along the way. Some of the deals were quite fair, some were not so fair at all, as I found out. His son, Moses Hatch, also lived in Falmouth. He had a couple of indigenous slaves. This is not the family, obviously, but it does show you something. It shows you the indigenous people could marry within themselves, they could marry within their own race, but they were a matrilineal society. So if you were a Wampanoag male, and you wanted to get married, you had to go to mom. And mom would say, yep, you can get married. Who is the family? Let me do some research. We talked to a few people, and I'll tell you if it's a green light or not. So it was very, very strict the way they did it. The other people that could marry were black slaves. They could marry slaves. There was a lot of intermarriage between blacks and indigenous. So it was very, very common. So when you trace bloodlines, especially in Cape Cod, there's a big, big mixture between black and indigenous people. This was just the way they did it. Also in Falmouth, we had a big Quaker population. And Quakers, of all the groups, you're going to find out more, but of all the groups in religion, were kind of anti-slavery, Falmouth was one of them. So this is the founder of the Quakers, this is George Fox in England. In Falmouth, I found they were buying slaves back. The Quakers at one point did not like slavery, depends on which group you were, which congregation and so on, but they bought them slaves, they bought them back. So right here in Falmouth, there was a slave there for 2 inches sharper, and the Quakers paid, I think it was $17 to free him, 17 pounds, whatever that equivalent was back then. That slave was a Negro man who was working in a farm. He was 35 years old, and he was sold to a fellow named Gifford, Benjamin Gifford. And on the day of selling it, he said, I'm so pleased to sell my boy. He's talking about a 35-year-old man. So it's just the way they used language back in that day. If you look to when people got arrested back in the colonial days, they didn't have prisons like we know them today. They didn't have jails. They really didn't. They had holding cells. There was a place in Barnstable, kind of that's not it, but it looks very much like that. It looks like a cave almost, because they didn't keep people for slavery long. So if you committed a crime, whatever that crime might be, or accused of a crime, and you were found guilty by the judge, you were put into a prison. And the prison looked not too dissimilar from that. That's for a day or two. After that, they said, what are we going to do with these people? They didn't want the expense of having, guards, food, and all the things that go in prison. So they would just give them away sometimes. So if you were arrested from 1620 to 1750, roughly, many, both white and black and indigenous, if you committed a crime, you could be sentenced to slavery, either indentured or regular slavery. But again, just being accused and being found guilty, that's a different matter too, sometimes. There's one fellow named Master Man. He was a white man. He didn't want to go to jail, so what did he do? He indentured 2 of his kids. He indentured one boy who was very young, 5 years old, I think, and then a daughter who was 19. Said, in lieu of me going to jail, please take my children. So that doesn't seem fair to me, but that's the way he felt about it. Again, this is another example. When we talk about the mastery of the indigenous slaves, they tried to portray an image that we're giving indigenous people jobs. We're giving them jobs. We're helping them. We're doing good things for them. The reality was they were slaves. I mean, they didn't have freedom. They couldn't walk around. They couldn't do what they wanted to do. Most everyone was. The Quaker group began a study in 1757, and every one of the indigenous slaves had a master. So they just, if you were given a job, but that doesn't mean you could do what you want. You were bound to that master. He or she could just determine where you do, what you do, how you do it. So that was just the way, they did it back then. In fact, the very beginning, Reverend Palmer, if you go in Falmouth, Palmer Avenue, he was the first minister of the church and one of the founding members of the church in Falmouth. And he had a couple of slaves. One of the slaves was Titus. Titus was responsible for domestic use and farming as well. He did farming as well. And his deacon, Benjamin Parker, had him as a slave, and he kept calling him Cuffy. We're learning more about the Cuffy family later. So the last name was Cuffy. Chances are pretty good you're a blend between an Ashanti, black, and kind of a European indigenous person. Probably the Cuffys there were a lot of mixed bloodlines with the Cuffys. We'll learn more about them in a minute. Another fellow from Falmouth, this fellow right here, his name was Anna, although his mother, actually, that's his mother, Anna B. Ray was his mom. His mom, one time in 1840, 73 women from Falmouth signed a petition. 3 of them were black, the other 70 were white women. And the petition went to Washington, D.C. They wanted all the slaves that were in Washington to be freed. So they sent to the Congress and said, we're petitioning on behalf of the slaves, we want them to be free. pretty sure she was the one who probably began the whole instigation of the whole thing, this Alice B. Ray. She was a big activist for anti-slavery. Could you imagine her husband, Joseph, who was a black man, for 29 years, rowed a boat, literally a small boat. He was the mail carrier. He would take the boat from Falmouth to Cutty-Hook, or Falmouth to sometimes even Nantucket, God forbid, and just every day rowed it back and forth. That's all he did. Could you? I just couldn't imagine rowing a boat that far for that long, for that many years, but he did. Apparently, he did it. Her son is this fellow right here. We're going to learn more about him in a minute. So Charles B. Ray, her son, he was born in Falmouth, one of 7 children. He eventually went to New York City, became a minister of one of the biggest churches in New York City, a very predominant church in New York. He was also a very, very big Underground Railroad person. They say of all the people who were connected with the Underground Railroad, he might be the biggest. They say he slaved at a minimum, at an average, 1 per day. So some days it might do 3, some days it might do none, some days it might do 4, but as an average, every single day for about 15 years, he saved somebody. Started up in Connecticut, and then he began writing a paper called The Colored People, which was an anti-slavery newspaper. So if people wanted to know more about what was happening in the world, they would read this paper and then know what was happening. He became a good friend with Frederick Douglass, and did a lot of teaching, a lot of lecturing too. Now, I wanted to show you this slide because this is the cover of my book. The reason I chose this particular cover, picture that you see in front of you, was by a fellow man named Prince Sears Crowell of Dennis. And he had this picture, he had a little box. What he would do, what he did, he actually began as a slave trader. And that I found a theme there. I found at least 15 to 20 people who began as slave traders and then eventually transferred to becoming slave savers. Okay, they wanted to end the population entirely. So he took this picture, I'm not sure who the artist was, but he made like a little box. I don't know if you remember, but I remember when I was a young kid, remember the March of Dimes? They give you like a little box and you put your dimes and your nickels and all that. So he began something on Cape Cod, equivalent to that. People have a box, that was the outside picture. People put their coins in there, and then somebody would go around town collecting that money. Could be the priest, could be town minister, it could be anybody. But they collected that money. All that money they raised would go to the anti-slavery endeavors. Okay, so again, one of the reasons I wrote this book, I was trying to find out in my own way, why would people even want to do slavery? Why was that morally acceptable then, where now it's not acceptable? Well, to some degree, it's not acceptable. Still going on today. We still have slavery today in many forms, but we won't get into that. But particularly in Boston, the reason I call it incongruity is because at the very beginning of our Bay State colony, from 1620 on, we were kind of the head of the New England slave trade. So many people who were brought here were slaves, or maybe began in Boston Harbor. And these are some of the men who were responsible for some of those activities. They did that. Let's go, I'll talk about them individually. So Maverick was a fellow, we get the name Maverick today. It's the same idea. If you're a Maverick, you're unusual, you're colorful, you kind of do your own thing in life. Oh, he was a Maverick. He was actually a British guy who came to the colonies. He wanted to find out how they can make more money. One of the things he did, he began a ferry. Had a ferry that went from Charlestown to Boston, and then back again. I was given a lot of land by the British in Chelsea, almost half the land is in Chelsea. He wrote a book called A Brief Description of New England for the Royalty. If you want to read another good book, mine's the best, but there's another good book other than mine, Bound to New England by Wendy Warren. In that book I couldn't believe a couple of things I read, but I did. There was a fellow who was on his boat one time, and he heard screams at night, horrible screams, and he went out to look, what's going on? This woman was out there, she was yelling in pain, and he was wondering what's going on. He said, Maverick, what's going on? He said, I told my slave to impregnate that woman. I want more chattel slavery. I want boys and girls to be under my domination. So, I mean, when you think about the cruelty of this, no agreement, no consensuality at all, just kind of raping people randomly so that he could have more slaves. Another guy's named Thomas Dudley. Dudley was the second governor in Massachusetts way back 1634. He was not a slaveholder himself, but he didn't have any problem with it. His sons, his daughters, his relatives, they all had slaves. In fact, there used to be a square called Dudley Square in Boston, and they changed the name, right? They changed it. Now it's Nubian Square. because there was so many opposition for it. They've been talking about changing family law now for what, 20 years now. Still haven't changed. Still have family law. That's why we have that name. But he was kind of unusual too, in that he was an advocate for slavery in some degree, but yet he also tried to give them fair housing and other things. And people didn't actually, they thought he was on the right side of the slavery, but more and more I'd say he was not particularly helpful, I wouldn't think. Another group right in the beginning too was Usher, John Usher. There's a group in Somerville. He took almost all of Somerville, a good part of it, 10 hills. He was given that land by the British in 1631. And he had a lot of slaves. He had probably 25, 30 slaves at any one time. The 10 farm hills had a number of different slaves group. They had the royal family after him, another family after him. The first 3 families that owned the land had a lot of slaves, and they developed the land. They had buildings, they had farm, they had agriculture. They did a lot of things that kept the farmland going altogether. Eventually, they got tired of him. So in the year 1689, his personality was kind of rigid too. He didn't bend very much. They eventually chased him out of Boston, and he moved up to New Hampshire. Another fellow with probably one of the biggest slaves traders was this guy, Charles Astrop. He was from Boston. If you look at Merchant Road today in Boston, he was the one. He had several ships that he would his ship coming in all the time. He was heavily into slave trading. He was considered one of the richest men in Boston. And he had a little paper, the Boston Gazette. There's a copy of the Boston Gazette. He would advertise, coming on Monday, the slave trades, 13 women, 14 men, whatever the number was. He would tell you, he would describe them like an advertisement, and you could come to the trade market. Where was it held? Different places. It could be church, could be square, but a lot of times right in front of Family Hall, right? The building right in front of Family Hall where they did a lot of slave trading. Sometimes in a tavern too. He belonged to King's Chapel. So if you've been to Filene's basement, or that area in Boston, King's Chapel was a church not far from it, so about a block away, kind of on the main drag there. That particular congregation in that year, one of those years, had 219 slaves among 55 congregants. So it showed it wasn't just a little, it wasn't just a few people. There were a number of people in Boston and beyond who were kept as slaves. This was a pretty big number, and this isn't there. In the early 1600s, or late 1600s for him, for that case. There we go, Peter Fowle, we talked about Family Hall. Peter Fowle was a frequent slave trader, made lots of money. His uncle in 1730 left him lots of dollars, and he was in charge of all the shipping that coming in and out of Boston. So he had to build a beautiful building, the colonial building. He donated it to the city of Boston. And I call this, my subtitle was Incongruity, because not only were we the first big slave trader, we were also the one who fought all the meetings we had, all of the maritime meetings against slavery were held at Family Hall. So depending on what year we were either pro-slave or anti-slave. You can say that either way possibly. By the way, as I'm going along, if you have a quick question, like a yes or no, don't be afraid to raise your hand. It's not that big a crowd, okay? If you want to get more detail, that by all means, keep it to the end then. So in doing the reading I did, all the different books I read, I would say in 1600 up to 1750-ish, maybe roughly, most of our slaves were indigenous people. So there were slaves in the Bay State Colony, but they were indigenous for the most part. Few here and there black, but not it was only for a particular reason. Like Boston had the buildings and so on. They built Harvard. Some of the buildings at Harvard were built by slaves, but for the most part, families had maybe 1 or 2 slaves. It wasn't that big a number. I was reading too in 1678, some indigenous people were broken into the homes at Sandwich, Falmouth, and Mashpee. And what would they do? Again, they wouldn't keep you in prison because they didn't want prison, so they just stole them out as slaves. That's how they paid people back sometimes, by giving them slaves. The first pastor in Truro, John Payne, he had a number of slaves, mostly all indigenous, as far as I know. He had 3 slaves in his lifetime. One was a young lady, one was a good working male. That surprised me. I was trying to get my handle or a degree of understanding who was against slavery, who was against it. And it was not political. Government was never against it. You just saw the people I told you before, the government people, they were definitely not anti-slavery. The minister was not anti-slavery. And even the press, for example, the press would run usually ads all the time. So there was very little opposition to black slavery, very little. Just people said, well, it's common. We're not continue doing it. Yeah, his Indian girl tried to run away, didn't we? Tried to run away, and he really punished her very harshly for being a runaway. So this is like a typical thing. This is a little later period, but that's just a picture of a lady from Boston. I looked under the Boston prominent people, and believe it or not, I found that picture. So people would be brave enough to say, I have a slave. It's like a social thing. I can afford a slave. I'm a woman of prominence. Nothing wrong with me having slaves, and I'm proud of it. So it's not unusual at all for that to take place. In Bourne, this is an unusual story, but there was a fellow named Zachariah Allen, 1670, thereabouts, I think. Natives broke into his home and his barn, and they were captured afterwards. And the courts mandated that Allen keep them as slaves for life. So I don't know about you, but if somebody broke into my house and then the court said you have to keep them as my slaves, I wouldn't be too happy with that. But that's what the courts decreed. You have to take this person, 2 or 3 of them, and you have to keep them as your slaves. Like, doesn't make a lot of sense, but because they were dangerous people to begin with. Also in that area too, around 6A, there's a farm, a pretty big farm called Wingscarton Farm. Maybe you've driven by it or driven past it. And for 2 times, in the 1700s, the farms were worked by indigenous people as slaves. And then in the mid-1800s, the fellow was very generous. He allowed slaves, runaway slaves, to stay there. So runaway slaves could hide there at night, sleep on the farm, and just go their merry way. So it's kind of depending on the year, it was a dual purpose, anti-slavery and pro-slavery endeavor. King Philip, one of our, and he's an Iroquois Indian, not native to Cape Cod, but he's more of the native kind of area, more of that neck of the woods. But he was the head sachem. We had a lot of the sister tribes, all of our tribes, all of our towns had many little diversified tribes. That little picture you see there was done by Paul Revere. I didn't know that Paul Revere was an artist. So he was a silversmith, as most people know. He took a piece of silver and made that picture by hand. So he was pretty ingenious in doing that. Originally, King Philip said, well, let's try to work with the European people. Let's try to be their friend, and maybe things will go away, things will kind of come in. But then they began realizing, and they came over in big numbers. Like, for example, in Cape Cod, maybe you had maybe 1,000 people in the year. Don't hold it to the exact number, but a small number, say 1,000 people in 1720 or 30. And then by the end of the century, you had almost 5,000, so 5 times more. And he said they're going to keep coming, they're going to keep coming. So there wasn't that much you can really do. So he began a big war. We'll talk about that war in a minute. Also found their homes too, in Sandwich and Bourne. There's the homes. There were Underground Railroad homes. Isaac Davis had a very long underground cellar. He kept a number of slaves there. Baptist Church had several. It was not unusual. Many people, maybe even universal homes in the area that have been used as runaway slaves. One of the big things that they did, if you were a runaway slave, if you could make it to New Bedford, which a lot made it to there, or Boston, they would then go to Provincetown, or the Provincetown of the Cape. Why would they go there? Because it really wasn't safe. If you were a runaway slave, we'll talk about that in a minute, but you weren't safe because they could still grab you if you were a slave. Even in Massachusetts, they had a Fugitive Slave Act. And so they had to get out. So many of the people went up north to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, went up to Canada. But a lot of fishermen would go there. So if you could make it to Boston, then you got to Provincetown, the fishermen would bring you up to Canada. So that would be a very typical route that people would take. And then we're here in Barnstable. We have a fellow named a lawyer, Trebiel Smith in Barnstable. He whipped his slaves to death. So he kept whipping and the guy finally died. And went to court. The court said, you can't kill people. Justice Samuel declared the slaves have the same right to life as the richest of people. So at least we kind of got a little bit common sense, but it took a while. It took until 1790 to get there. He never went to trial. He paid a fine. He was a rich man. He paid a fine. And that was it. Let's talk about the religion now a little bit. So what the religious view is. So I'm just trying to figure out why would people be pro-slavery again. So we'll talk a little bit about the various opinions. Before we had a Massachusetts colony, we had a Virginia colony. They came a couple years before 1620. There, the Virginia colony was like 1606. Captain John Smith saw no problem having indigenous slaves, not too many blacks, mostly indigenous slaves. The Puritans didn't have a problem with it either. There was a group of people who made the laws up for the colonies. You can slaves, you can legitimately, legally bring slaves over. They made up rules on what you could do and how you could do it. Congregationalists were interesting. Congregational originally, many of the Congregationalists were directed by the slaves, like sea captains. When you think about it, it kind of made sense in a way, because sea captains didn't want to end slavery. Why? Because they were making money, if not directly, indirectly. Right? So anytime you make a slave, you're bringing cotton up here. You may not be a slave owner, but you're helping the slave. If you sell fish or food to the plantations, you're helping them indirectly. So that was they eventually, most congregational ministers would say something like, yeah, we want to end slavery. We'll do it next year, or we'll do it the year after that, maybe. So they kept postponing, and they really didn't want to do it. There was one church I found where I live in Brewster. Right there's a road called Red Top Church, and it was really interesting. I wish I could do a whole book on this church one time, but they went through different periods of time where they tried to help slaves, and then they weren't, and they kind of think. But they lost half their congregation one year because they didn't want to end slavery immediately, and that became a real problem for that particular church. Jewish people, I mean, that's in the Bible. The Jewish people, you know where we get the word slaves from? The word slave, a lot of the Slavic people, 3,000 years ago, were taken as slaves and brought to different people's homes. We get slaves from the word Slavic. There were people that were just confiscated during a war, and that's how we got that particular word. But the Jewish people had a kind of a tradition. If you owe them money, but it's a whole different concept for the Jewish people. Because if you ran a house, this person might live with you, might have dinner with you, maybe treated very fairly, but you're still a slave. You still had to do exactly what they told you to do. So it's a little different concept of that religious group. Catholic view is quite different. Catholic view, when I was a young boy, I remember going to a Columbus Day parade. That was like maybe even before high school, probably the 8th grade maybe. I remember marching in the Columbus Day parade. At one time back then, he was like a hero. Columbus discovered America. Columbus, he was a great, great hero. And then we found out a few things about him. We found out that he brought 500 slaves to Queen Isabella, and she didn't even want them. She said, I don't want you to engage in slavery. But he kept doing it. He kept bringing slaves back. He would confiscate indigenous people and bring them back to Europe. He had a contract with Queen Isabella that everything he brought back, he would get a residual of 10%. They get money back. So he thought this was a great deal. Why not keep this going? So eventually tide turned. Now Columbus Day is like half Indigenous People Day and half Columbus Day. For some people, depending which way you celebrate it. But, he's not given the full thing. But the bull, the doctrine of discovery, which they even talk about now in the Supreme Court, saying if you're doing it for the right reason, you can do it. You can keep slavery for the right reason, which is just the way it was back then. Kind of an understanding of how slavery grew and why it grew. Quakers are probably the only religious group that were kind of, we mentioned George Fox before. They would buy people, they would buy slaves. So he was kind of definitely was not for it, but it was a very mixed group. The Quakers, for example, in 1688, there was a big convention of Quakers in America, in Cape Cod actually, and Benjamin Lundy was one of the congregants, and he went to the convention to give a very fiery anti-slavery talk. So under his shirt, he put a pig blood. He had like a little vial of pig blood. And he said, there shall never be slavery, and it's immoral and it's wrong, and I can't live in a country like this. He took a sword and pierced it through his jacket, and the blood ran down, and people began fainting and getting all upset, but he didn't kill himself. He just pretended to, but to get attention. But even after that, they didn't change the village. They didn't keep slavery as part of their thing. The reason I show this slide in particular, that's Brown University. Quakerism has, if you look at the two brothers, you got John Brown, who founded Brown University, and his brother, Moses Brown, was kind of more anti-slavery. So they were kind of mixed. It was only in the year 1770 that officially Quakers were the only group, the first group, to condemn slavery. But they did do it. It took them a long time to get there. I'll talk more about the brown guys in a minute. Now, to show you how the British looked at it, the British, even as early as 1620, even before 1620, they captured people along the aisles here. So there was a Captain Hunt, the British captain. He took 24 weaponized Indians, just grabbed them, put them on a boat, shipped them to England. One of these was this particular guy here, his name's Squanto. His Indian and indigenous name was Tistiquan, but he was known, we call him Squanto. And he went to England, he went to Spain, went to a couple places. Finally, some Spanish monks said, it's not right to keep people enslaved. He brought them back. So when the Puritans came here, you just heard of Squanto. So he was the fellow who showed the colonists how to plant, how to live, how to do things. So again, but he was formerly a slave. And the two indigenous wars that we had two of them, neither one in particular here in Cape Cod, but they were big wars though. The Pequod War was more in the Connecticut kind of area, but that was big. How did they pay the soldiers? If you fought for your colony, Connecticut, Massachusetts, whatever you fought for, the colony, that was a way of payment. You could pay a little bit of money if they had money, if the colony had money. If not, they paid you, you get 2 slaves or 3 slaves, they give you a payment of slaves for fighting for the country. King Philip's War was a much bigger war. And eventually, one of the reasons why people would prefer it, what do you think people, let's think about this, why would you kind of not trust black slaves? Why would you trust black slaves more than indigenous slaves? Anybody have a rationale why that would be? Because they're thinking, again, not my thinking, but their thinking of the day was if you're a native, okay, and you're captured, you have friends, you have people, you know the territory, you know how to maneuver the land, you know how to make a living, you could call relatives up, okay? But if you're black, don't know the language, don't know what's going on, didn't have political rights, had much lower rights than even the indigenous people did. So it came to be that's why they thought, and by 1750, the population of indigenous people dramatically is diminished. They died of different things, they died of diseases and other things. In fact, when that Squanto, the guy we saw before, when he came back, his entire tribe was eliminated. It was just dead, just all gone. So he had to go to a different tribe to get some security himself. Then we have a thing called voluntary and involuntary indentured servants. And people think this is very benign. It probably was benign to some degree, but the more I looked into it, not completely benign either, not completely kind to people. So if you were in Europe, particularly England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, those countries in particular, and you wanted to have, your country's not doing well, you can't get a job, you would come to America, and you could do it one of 2 ways. Sometimes they had a list of people, families say, I want a cook, I want a domestic, I want a heavy laborer, I want a horse trainer, I want a particular type of trade, and they would kind of match people up. They would match the people that didn't get your service up. But when they came over, it could be a 5-year thing, could be a 10-year thing, but theoretically, they could not do a lot of things. They could not leave the house. They could never have dates. They can't have social engagement, can't talk to people. They were just confined to the home. And they had to do exactly what they were told to do. And looking at the birth rate and the death rate of servants, they're about 10 years less than most colony. So that to me indicates that probably their life is harsher. They probably weren't treated all that well, maybe not given the best food and not treated too fairly. So this is one of the things I would say. And then you have a thing called involuntary servitude. Not much, but there was some of that too. So there was a fellow named William Pynchon, as early as 1635. There was a jail in England, pretty good sized jail, and there were a lot of young men who were in jail for different reasons. Could be debt, could be money, could be small crime. It wasn't even big crimes for the most part. But he would take a wholesale, like sometimes 30, 40 men at a time, ship them to America and put them to work as slaves. They would work. That's involuntary servitude, which I don't see a big difference between involuntary servitude, like just taking people who don't want to be here and put them in there. They didn't give the prisoners a choice. They took orphanages too. They took young kids sometimes, or very young children, sometimes to do their bidding. You see him burning a book there. He wrote a book called The Meritorious Price of Redemption, which is a kind of an anti-Puritan book. So we said books banned in Boston. You get that from this guy. That was the first book ever banned. He wrote a book which is anti-Puritan, and that didn't go over too well with the Puritans. We learned a lot from the British too. The British if American slave traders were pretty bad, with the British and the Portuguese were even worse. They were ferocious. They were really harsh, much harsher than the American slave traders. But we learned from them. We learned from John Hawkins was a real big slave trade. He was knighted by the Queen, and you could see the emblem here. He's given an official title and so on. He was knighted. Even his emblem shows a black slave prominently, as the Queen said, wonderful. She thought that was a great emblem for him to use, it's used for his royalty. I would say the other thing too, which I noticed too, whalers from again, the early days to maybe mid 1700s, most of the whalers who came in, and whaling is about 1/3 of all the shipping. Well, about 1/3 of the shipping was one commercial, one was whaling, and one is other types of boat endeavors. But the 1/3 that were whalers were almost all indigenous people. So the way they got the indigenous people to be slaves was mom or dad lived in Mashpee, typically, or it could be anywhere, but it could be Mashpee. And then they said, well, okay, you bought 2 blankets, you bought some food, you bought some rum, you bought some whatever they bought, keep a record of what they bought, and said, okay, now is the time, pay me. I'll give you 1 day or 2 days or a short amount of time. And if they couldn't pay, they would indenture their son for 5 years. And they would take the son, he had to work on a boat. So that was very common practice back in the early days. Here's an interesting picture. I don't know what you think. I'm not sure what this guy's doing, but he's looking at you, the guy in the left-hand corner. You're kind of saying he's attending a black colonial slave market. I'll give an example of George Washington, our president, as he was actually a president back then. He had a slave called Ona Washington. And Ona was a seamstress. She knew clothing, she knew how to make clothing, and she was very talented at what she did. First, she began in Philadelphia, first in New York and Philadelphia, and then she became president. You had to move sometimes depending where the capital was. So as it turned out, she kind of got used to seeing her friends and relatives, some black people who were free in Philadelphia, and said, wait a minute, why should I be a slave? And they're free, the same skin color I have, I shouldn't be enslaved. So she took it upon herself to escape, and she escaped to Boston. She came to Boston first. Martha Custis with more money, much more money than George did. And it was actually her slaves that we're talking about here. And the custom back then was if you lose a slave, you had to give your money, you had to pay the owner a debt. You had to pay them some restitution for losing that slave. So you had to be really careful. Could you imagine the president of the United States, and if you just give the slave away, don't do anything, the Southern people wouldn't be too happy with that. If he's too vigorous and actually attack the slave and he's brought it back forcefully, that wouldn't go too well with the Northern people. So he very timidly kind of pursued her. He wanted her to come back, and he had men pursue her and talk to her. Finally, she heard wind of it, and she eventually went to Canada. She said, it's not safe for me to anywhere. So she eventually made her escape. Salad was a big boat. It was kind of one of the biggest slave boats. Again, we talked about the Moses brothers, John and Moses Brown. Well, the Salad was going to bring a lot of slaves over, almost 200 slaves on this one endeavor. 109 of them never came back alive. 81 of them were killed. They died with starvation, suicide. Could you imagine they're chained on this ship underneath? They couldn't go above board. If somebody next to you got violently ill, you couldn't move. You were like 2 feet away from them. You were chained to them, literally. So you couldn't move. I mean, so if God forbid you get ill, there wasn't much you can do. There was no doctor. There was no, the food is substandard. So a lot of people in that particular voyage, almost 1/3 of the slaves took their own lives. They just felt like, if I have to live like this, I don't want to live. And that changed, by the way, very soon after that, 1770s, when the Quakers changed their mind. Just kind of woke up the Quakers and saying, wait a minute, this is really hard. We can't do slavery anymore. So that's why one of the reasons. Yes, sir.
What were the number of voyages?
What did she do?
How many voyages?
2 or 3, about 3 that I know of. Might have been more, but at least 3 anyway. This guy used to cop. He sounded like a real cruel captain. He was literally, he would just whip people. Looked at him the wrong way, he just threw it over the boat. He was very, very ruthless. Now the laws, we looked at religion, we looked at politics a little bit. Let's look at the laws, the legal laws about slavery. So in 1641, we had a law which supposedly ended slavery. But let's read it for a little bit. It is ordered by this court, there shall be never any bond, slavery, villanage, or captivity among us, unless it be captive taken in just war, as an exception. Those people are willing to sell themselves. I don't know if there are too many of those, but there might be some. Or those that were sold to us. I'm not sure what that means. Actually sold to us. How did they get them? So it's very, and then at the very bottom it says, these exemptions, who we judge therefore by authority. So even after all of that, if the authority says, no, you're a slave. I'm sorry, but you're a slave. So it was really vague. Even though it's supposed to be anti-slavery, I don't read it like that. I just think you can interpret that a lot of different ways. And then the amendment to that particular act, a little bit here later, we will allow among us no actions that are inhumane, barbarous, or cruel. No man shall be beaten with above 40 stripes. That's a whiplash, for one fact at a time. So you do one thing wrong, you can get 40 whacks with a whip. And many people died. You know, those whippings were not fun at all, except for the crime, or unless it's going to be very shameful. So that's supposed to be helping people. I don't see that being helpful. Anytime you do something wrong, you're going to get 40 whacks with a whip. I don't think that was the best deal in the world. Here's where it began changing now. The judge we had, Judge William Cushing, in Massachusetts, in our Supreme Court, we had a Cushing fellow. In 1780, we had a Mom Bet case. I'm not sure if you heard of Mom Bet. But Mom was a slave out in the western, I'm not sure, Springfield, somewhere in that area, maybe Pittsfield somewhere. She was at home one night, and her sister was there, and the owner of that house had a frying pan. She was going to just whack her sister, you know, almost practically kill her or whatever. She was going to just attack her with a frying pan. So she intervened and knocked the woman down, knocked the owner down. So eventually they wound up in court. So the judge listened to the case and heard the goods and bads and said, she said, that's not humane. That's not the way we should treat human beings. So she gave Mom Beth her freedom. That was the first beginning of the cracking of the wall a little bit, at least in Massachusetts. After that, a couple of years after that, we had a fellow named Quag Walker. He was up in Barre, Mass, Central Mass. And he had a very mean master too. He was being whipped a lot, an awful lot. So he ran away and then was captured. And then he was allowed to, by the way, even indigenous slaves could bring a court case. But again, if you didn't have the money, the wherewithal, or the ability to defend yourself, if they didn't have the skills to, you know, conduct a court case by themselves, they had to have an advocate. But he had one. And finally, he won this case too. That was the year, 1783 was the official year that Massachusetts had no more slavery, they should not have slavery. However, if that ended, not really. No, we still had slaves. Up until the Civil War, we had slaves in Massachusetts, Cape Cod, every town. Let me give you a little clue. If you get the town records, any town record, which I have, I got to a few towns, I went to 7 or 15 towns, and I looked at the wills. You know, I leave Israel to my family. I give Ethan to my sister. I give Nathan to my daughter. It's like, come on. I mean, that's not your child. That's a slave. And every town had those slaves. So I'd say we had, I can't give you the exact number. One reason why you can't examine slavery too carefully, one big reason was, think about in 1700, if you were a pro-slave individual, if you wanted slavery, okay, you couldn't because the state law wouldn't allow you. 1783, you couldn't do slavery, right? So you couldn't brag about it, do anything about it. At the same time, if you were a pro-slavery person, and you really wanted to have more slaves and stuff of that nature, the Fugitive Slave Act would come along and say, I think you are a slave. I just declare you to prove to me that you're not. And of course, people don't walk around with documents. They couldn't prove themselves wrong. So a lot of Black people would come here, run away, and then just be taken right back. And many of them, I would say all of them, it's got a good number, were not even slaves to begin with. So you read the book 12 Years a Slave and things of that nature. So that was very common. It was very common, not very common, but common. And it did happen more than once. All right, now we're going to get into some sea captains. This is a variation of what the Cape Cod sea captains did. I found this part, the main reason I did it, but all of it was a preamble to get to this part, I think. So one of our big slave traders of the day was a guy that was a British guy. It was not a Cape Cod man. He was a British man. He had a nightingale. He was called the King of the Slavers. One time he was caught with a ship, he had 2,000 slaves on it. He was bringing it into Boston Harbor. Now, amazingly enough, just as the trial began, he managed to get away. It's like, boy, there's no trial. And also people found out that the guards who were involved took a bribe and they managed to let him escape and so on. So it happened twice. He was caught with, with the goods, so to speak, but he was never prosecuted. He was able to escape both times. And we talked about this before, but it's not direct. There's certainly a lot of indirect beneficiaries to captains. Because some of the captains, if you bring cotton up, if you bring tobacco up, and even the rum trade, if let's say we brought wood to Africa and then Africa to the West Indies, that's the slave trade. And with anything on the slave trade, with the rum, that's how they delivered slaves from West Indies. They took more slaves and brought them back here. So it was very common for most of the people who did that to not want to end the slavery because they would profit. If there's no slavery at all, they couldn't do some of the shipping and some of the businesses they did. So I'd say it's very indirect, but yet beneficial to those people. This fellow here is one of my heroes, Austin Burse. If you ever drive on Hyannis, right in the middle of town, there's Burse Avenue or Street and so on, yeah. And he was born as a slave trader. For the first 10 years of his life, he was actively engaged in slave trading. He was talking 1820, 1830s. You could tell it wasn't illegal back then. It wasn't illegal, but they didn't enforce it very well. So one of the things he did was one of his jobs when he was a slave trader was to bring the whole family to the auction block. And he had to separate. So mom and dad would be in one place, mom would go here, dad would go here, children would go there. He had to separate the families so people could bid on the various slaves. He did that for a number of years and then finally just got to him. He said, I can't continue doing this. I can't. So he said in his book, actually, if you're interested, if you really want to do it, you can go to Sturgeon Library, as I have. There's a book that he wrote in I forget the year exactly, but he said, I shall trade no more beyond the Mason-Dixon line. If you want to get hold of his book, he wrote it in 1830s. You can hold it in your hand. It's a kind of wear white gloves, be really careful. But he talks about what his experience was as a slave trader. But what he did later, let me tell you a little more what he did later. He went to Boston and became the harbor master for Boston. And the reason he did that because he was anti-slavery now kind of firmly anti-slavery. He kind of came up with the idea, so let's try to save these people. So there was some group of people called the Boston Vigilance Committee. Many of them came right from Vienna. So you had people like William Lloyd Garrison, you had Russell Marston, you had Lucy Stone. Some of these people just were anti-slavery and they began this anti-slavery campaign. And he was one of them. So what he would do, he would contact a slave boat owner and say, hey, if you get to Virginia, in this particular harbor, Portsmouth Harbor, Virginia, I can get you 10 people because you bring them up here. So what they would do, they would bring slaves up near Boston, and he would have a picture. I'll show you that picture in a minute. He would go out and save these people. Now, some captains are just accused of being a slave trader. This is my town, but Elijah Cobb was the one boat in particular called the 10 Brothers, and they say that he went to West Africa. Two of the captains actually died in West Africa at a port that was very conducive to slavery. But yet, when that boat came to town, there's no evidence. The Boston Board of Health confiscated the boat. And for a year, they actually examined the boat carefully. They found no evidence of slave trading. So some people call him a slave trader, but again, I couldn't find direct evidence that he was. I'm saying it wasn't. I wasn't there. People have connections and polls politically, so it could have been, but I would say I can't correct that. The picture you see there, Cobb had a boat confiscated one time in France. France took a boat from Elijah Cobb, and just took the whole boat, the cargo and everything. So he took it upon himself to go to Paris to negotiate. Said, you got to give me some money recompense for my boat. Unfortunately, the day he got there was during the Reign of Terror. The Jacobean people were chopping people's heads off. So he was there 2 days later. Sure enough, even though that's Robespierre's picture right there, he's a French diplomat. Robespierre said, I will give you money, but then they held his head up in the square and they just decapitated him. The guillotine, they just took his head. So it's kind of a brutal time period as well. All right, let's talk about some sea captains of color. And if there's any trade, any way that people could be meritorious and kind of move up the ladder, that was one of them. So if you could manage to get to the north and work on a whaling boat, they usually didn't question you all that heavily. If you could do the job, that's fine. They would hire you. So a lot of people would try to make it to New Bedford. New Bedford is a very common area. People go from New Bedford wherever they could go, and they eventually became free. So there's two people in particular. These two guys are from Nantucket. This fellow is named Absalom Boston. he was a free black slave. He actually captained a whaling boat, and the whole crew was the black people. So it was kind of a shock. A lot of people, he went up and down the coast with whaling products and so on, and what people say, oh, this is a whaling boat? Why are these black people? Nothing but black people. It was kind of shocking for his time, but he did that. In addition, he had a young daughter who wanted to go to public schools in Nantucket. And at that time, they wouldn't allow them to do that. They wouldn't allow black children in the public schools. So he and many other people, he wasn't the only one. He went to the general court and said, you have to have an integrated school. You can't allow black kids not to attend school. And that case eventually went in his favor. Another guy who I admire too is guy Paul Cuffey. We talked about the Cuffey family before a little bit. There was a movement called the American Colonization Society Movement, ACS they call it. And what they wanted to do, many presidents, we're talking just before the Civil War, Henry Clay was a big guy, Madison, Monroe, a number of presidents said, let's get all the blacks gathered together, put them on a boat, and ship them to Sierra Leone. And this guy, Paul Cuffey, was very well respected. He was a very wealthy man. He was free. He had a big well. He had a family. He had like a lot of in-laws and relatives. He had probably 15 boats that his family navigated, and a lot of pull. He said, I'll see what I can do. I'll support this movement initially. And then the more he looked into it, one thing I give him credit for, he talked to everybody. Before he made a final decision, he talked to slave traders. He talked to slaves themselves. He talked to governments. He talked to anybody he could. Is this good or bad? What's the negative? What's the positive? Not just destroy it immediately, but think about it. He gave really thoughtful reflection. And eventually he said, no, it's not right. To have them move them to another continent against their will, it's not right either. So they didn't do it as a gesture of goodness, which is like anti-black and white. They didn't want integration. They didn't want the two races to mix. So he said that's wrong. So he kind of came to the conclusion he wouldn't advocate for that group. And then you have some people like this guy Jack Hammond, and he wasn't the only one. There were a few really unscrupulous people, unconscionable people, who would take money from slaves. Say, we're going to go to Providence, we're going to go somewhere north. If you can come, I'll take your money. Come on, pay me. And then when they landed, sometimes even before they landed, but usually when they landed, he would then make a way to contact the police, and they would take the slave back, and then we get money from the owner. So he would collect both ways. He collect money from the slaves who thought they were escaping, and then collect money from the owner who had to pay a fee to get it back. But that picture you see there was a picture that was in the Liberator, which was a paper published in Boston. William Lloyd Garrison, guy who lives right in Riano, by the way, and he said this is wrong. In a way, it was wrong. So that's kind of get the word out. It kind of little by little, we kind of got the word out more and more. Another guy who was pro-slavery sympathizer was a fellow from Harwich, Jonathan Walker. He one time tried to help some people, some Africans on the island off the coast of Florida. He knew they were there. He put his boat there to get them away, and he was caught with the slaves on board. Remember back then, you had to be the Fugitive Slave Act. If you catch a slave, you can't keep them. You had to bring them back to the authority. There was a federal law. So he tried getting away with it. He was caught, spent a year in jail in Florida. Eventually, he took his hand, and you can see, I don't know if you can see it clearly or not, but they stamped the branding SS on his hand. That was his punishment. So he was a slave saver. So SS meant he was someone not to be trusted. He was a slave saver. Now, two more people. These are kind of incidental things, but I find them interesting. Jonathan Bourne, the fellow who the town of Bourne is named after. He had a big whaling ship ownership. He owned at least 17 different whaling ships. He was in charge of the Republican Party in 1860. When the Republican Party first met in Chicago, most of the delegates wanted to have William Seward as their representative for president. William Seward, the father, the Alaska guy who we acquired land from. That's people going in thought he was a dead lot. But this guy Bourne spoke on behalf of Abraham Lincoln. So I think Lincoln would be a much better choice. Eventually he won the case. So I always wonder how our country might be different today if he didn't advocate. I wonder how it would have happened different, but certainly be a lot different in many ways. Another guy who was kind of weird, kind of strange too, was a Squire Doane from Yarmouth. He was the head of the temperance movement, but yet he had one of the biggest taverns in town. So it didn't make a lot of sense. And then he was also the contact for runaway slaves, but then he would quickly sell them. That didn't make sense either. The other thing, he was supposed to be pro-American, but he wanted to be paid in Spanish money because he got more money from the banks. So he got away with it. He became very wealthy, but I don't get it. Remember I talked about the William Garrison. So here is a ship, that sailing ship that you see in the picture there. It's called the Moby Dick. So that's a big sailing ship that would bring slaves to Boston Harbor, near it anyway. And then either he directly or his friend would have a little rowboat, I think a dory, go out to the boat, take the black person and bring him to safety. So that was one of his mechanisms to get slave trade. We think of this Underground Railroad as being the big thing, and it is big. But I would say most from what I read, 80% of people who escape is through the maritime process. Maybe they use the maritime once they got here. But you couldn't go from Georgia to here without crossing a whole bunch of stops along the way. So much more easier, so more convenient to take a boat to New Bedford and then get connected to somebody and move up to Canada or whatever to do. So I would say the Underground Railroad did have a place, but it wasn't as big as maybe people think. So who was on this committee? So you had Austin Beers, we had Garrison, we had Russell Marston. He began a great big restaurant in Boston, the Marston Restaurant. And people would go there, and it was all black, mostly black people working. So the chefs, the cook, the waiters, everybody was black. And not only that, women were not allowed to go to a restaurant without a male at that time. He said women can come if you're, doesn't make a difference what your gender is or your race. You could go and have lunch at his place. So that's interesting. Frederick Douglass for a while lived here. Lucy Stone. These are all people who were on this committee, the Boston Vigilance Committee, Anti-Slavery Committee. Harriet Beecher Stowe, before she wrote her book, contacted Austin Beers and talked about slavery. That's one of her pivot. She'd never been on a plantation in her life. She wrote the book just by talking to other people. And Beers was one of the people that she spoke with to get an image of what plantations was like. Another fact people may or may not know, one of our biggest anti-slavery conventions was right here in Harwich. The first one was 1848, 2,000 people, which was huge. Probably half the population of Cape Cod, probably at that point. Well, not quite that much, but there's a big chunk of money, and a chunk of people anyway. So what happened? Remember I talked about that Jack Hannum, the people would take money and then, advocate and then free them anyway. So that's called the bulwark democracy. And they pointed out how dangerous it was for slaves to give money and then be treated unfairly. They were just brought to any port in town. Eventually, the sea captains, mostly they ran them out of town. The sea captain said, "How dare you impose upon our livelihood, our way of doing life? We're making money on this. You should have no right to talk to us." I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it was pretty severe. They just chased all the people attending this convention out, which included those people I talked about before, Lucy Stone, all those people, Frederick Lewis. They chased them out of town completely. But then there was a second convention, 1860. Now it got very serious. Because now everything I read, it's kind of like a boiling point. Now the pot was really boiling really hot by 1860. And that's when they said there shall be no union without full abolitionism. So they put their foot down saying, the only thing we will accept is slavery ending tomorrow. Really tomorrow, not down the road, but tomorrow. And that kind of swayed a lot of people, at least up in North anyway, to end that situation. Now, I talked just my final part. I got a couple of people who are black people living in Massachusetts. Mostly all slaves. So this guy was one. Frederick Douglass was a well-known slave, obviously. Came here to New Bedford, lived there with a caulker. Caulker is somebody who takes a boat. You could take whale blubber and tar, mix it together, and put it on the bottom of the boat to make it safe. That was his trade. So he was hung around the parts. He came from Maryland. He came up here, but he was a great speaker. He was not formally educated. But he had a great deep resonant voice and projected well. So he spoke a lot of times for Garrison at these various conventions. Crispus Attucks, if you go way back, was a runaway slave from Boston, from Framingham. You've heard of the Boston Massacre? So he was the first American killed, they say, during it's pre-revolutionary, it's a little bit before the American Revolution. But there was a time when a young boy from Boston threw a stick at a British kid, a British soldier, and the very next day, the British soldier wanted to retaliate. They wanted to fire back on the American kids. They were going to, and this guy Crispus Attucks began by throwing rocks and stuff at the British, and he got shot. So he was kind of a rallying cry for the American cause. Phyllis Weekly, that's interesting. She came over on the boat to Phyllis, and she was adopted by the Weekly family. So that's how she got her name, Phyllis Weekly. She had a family which took her over, the Weekly family. Two girls who were well educated, taught her Greek, taught her Latin, taught her poetry. And she could master all of that. And she was very adroit, has a very, very sharp mind. She wrote Greek and Latin poems, which became recognized. Lincoln wanted to meet her. The Queen of England wanted to meet her. So she did really well. Unfortunately, near the end of her life, became a little less popular, a little less known, and she died in poverty. She died in Boston, but she had very, very little money. Another one, Sojourner Truth, you probably heard of her. She lives up in the western part of Florence, Mass. But she was more than just anti-slave. She was a pacifist, woman's right, and temperance. So she captured a lot of different categories. She wanted a lot of things to change in America. She wanted to do all of that to change as much as possible. But she advised Lincoln on a number of matters. Sergeant Gooding, I haven't heard that name before, but he was one of the military guys in the 54th Mass All-Black Unit during the Civil War. So he fought. And the very first skirmish, he was actually involved with that. He wrote a letter to Lincoln as a black military guy and said, could you answer two questions for me, Mr. Lincoln? Number one, why are black soldiers paid less than white soldiers, which they were, quite a bit less. White soldiers made more money, black a little less. And why are the differences in where we live, how we live, and, quality of food, and all of these things, keeping me on base, was segregated. I couldn't go anywhere near the white people. He said, why are those two things there? And he never did get an answer for that. And I think Lincoln was sympathetic, but he politically probably couldn't do it very much. Another guy I found this guy very interesting too. He lived in Mashpee for a while, retired there. He was born a slave, but he has a very, very good mind. He was able he designed steam engines. So in the 1830s and 40s, he went to Annapolis to work as an intern, like in a laboratory, and was like a lab assistant. But he actually designed boats that the Navy adopted. But he couldn't have a patent. Back then, if you were black, you couldn't have a patent, scientific patent. You had to give it to somebody. You couldn't file the application. So he had to give the money, the patent to the Navy, and the Navy was filed his behalf. But they say he was one of the greatest designers of ships back in his day. And I think the final guy, I think it's the final one, William Appice. He was wrote a book called Natives of the Forest, and he tried to advocate for the Mashpee Indians, for the indigenous people, and the black people too. And this book pointed out how most of the time the indigenous people were taken advantage of. They were given alcohol, they were given, a very, very bad situation, almost oppressive situation, and so you have to sell your land immediately. I want you to sell this piece of property. So he pointed that out. Unfortunately, he himself died from alcoholism. So it was a bad example to follow. And that's it.